Hello my friends, welcome to another Cynic video. In this one we're going to be looking at homeostasis, specifically focusing on how homeostasis and hormones regulate reproduction, how they can be used in contraception and other methods of contraception, and how we can then treat infertility. So let's get to it. When we're looking at reproduction, a lot of the characteristics that have developed and the changes that happen on a regular cyclical basis for females is all due to hormonal changes and hormones controlling them. So this regulatory system of homeostasis in the body, if you like, is all down to hormones. So in men, we have the testosterone hormone, which is produced by the testes and the testicles, and it stimulates sperm production. Now, this sex hormone, like the sex hormones for females, causes the changes that you see during puberty, which cause secondary sex characteristics to develop. In females, however, there are more hormones than just one. There are four, in fact, that we need to know about. The main two are estrogen and progesterone, which estrogen probably being the one that you've heard the most about. Both of these are produced in the ovaries, so in the actual sex organ itself, and the ovaries are here. And these basically will both control the maintenance of the uterus lining. They have slightly different times at which they work, but they both will basically maintain the uterus lining, so that an egg cell that's fertilized can implant there and develop into a fully developed embryo, into a fetus, into a baby. But estrogen also has a role of stopping something called FSH being produced, which is what we'll look at in a second, and it stimulates the release of LH. So what are these other two hormones here, the FSH and LH? Well, FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. Now, to put in context what the name of this hormone actually is, a follicle is where an egg cell will be found before it really matures. So the follicle is what needs to be stimulated to get an egg cell to mature before it can later be released. So the follicle stimulating hormone is released early in the menstrual cycle. It's produced by the pituitary gland, so not the sex organ at all. It's produced in the pituitary gland, which is in the center of your head. And this FSH will cause the eggs to become mature in the ovary. So it has to travel through the blood, go to the ovaries, and cause the eggs in the ovary to become mature. And it won't cause all of them to mature at once. It will cause one, maybe two, depending on the species of the animal, usually one in humans, and cause them to become mature. The other hormone that we need to know is luteinizing hormone, LH. You can call it FSH and LH, by the way, you don't need to write out the full name. This is also produced in the pituitary gland, and this one stimulates the release of the egg. So we have to have two things happen. We have to have, number one, the egg become mature, and number two, the egg then be released, which is why estrogen here has a role of, number one, stopping the production of FSH, so it stops the FSH production because the egg is now mature, and then number two, causes the stimulation of the release of LH, which will cause the release of the egg. Wonderful. So those are the roles of these hormones. Let's put them into context in the cycle a little bit more so we can see how they fit together and how their levels will fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle. If you're doing foundation, you need to know these hormones and what they do, but you don't need to necessarily put them together into the full cycle. You don't need to explain how they relate to each other and how they work together to control the menstrual cycle. But in higher tier we do, and we also have to be able to analyze graphs a bit like this, which can seem fairly complicated and overwhelming, but really if we talk through it, it's not too bad at all. So the menstrual cycle typically takes about 28 days, and in these 28 days the uterus lining will be built up. So this part of the graph here shows the lining of the uterus, and we can see that from day 0 it's getting built up and up and up and up to a nice thick level where the blood supply is nice and good, and it's ready for implantation. And then after this period of about 20 odd days, we then have a period of menstruation where the uterus lining is lost to then again be replaced in the next cycle. And we also have an important time in this menstrual cycle where we have ovulation happening, which is the release of the egg. And on this graph, we've also got the representation of the different levels of hormones involved in this cycle. In the first part of the cycle, we have FSH being increased, and this is causing the maturation of the egg in the ovary. And we also have an increased level of estrogen, and estrogen here, its job is to start the development of the lining of the uterus. And then these two, well, the FSH drops off, but the estrogen then comes to a peak. And as it comes to a peak, it's stopping the production of FSH, which is why the FSH level drops off, and it's stimulating the release of LH. So LH level then goes up and up and up to a very big peak. And at this peak of LH, you can see that point there is where we have ovulation. Ovulation is the release of the egg. And so at this point, the estrogen levels drop right down because its job of stimulating the LH release is gone. And it's basically causing the release of the egg. And then the progesterone levels, the estrogen levels increase again. They want to further increase the lining and develop the lining of the uterus so that the hopefully fertilized egg. So the egg gets released and hopefully it gets fertilized at some point on its journey. And then it will implant into the uterus lining where it can take lots of nutrients and blood supply so that it can grow really well and develop into a full baby. These then estrogen and progesterone levels drop off again. As they drop off again, that causes the start of menstruation as the uterus lining is then shed. If there is an implantation, the implantation will cause a different pathway. It will cause a different hormone to be released, which will cause the uterus lining to be maintained and actually further developed to support the growth of the baby. So that's kind of the overview that we need to know. So we need these roles of the hormones, and you then need to be able to explain. They'll give you a graph. They need to be able to explain how, for example, why luteinizing hormone has a peak here at ovulation. That's because it is causing the release of the egg. You need to discuss perhaps why progesterone levels are high in this stage where the uterus lining is being developed. Well, that's because progesterone maintains the uterus lining. That's its job. So usually it's fitting what you need to know, these bits of knowledge, to data, which is a common important skill that we have in science. So learn the skill rather than learning the answers to this graph. Learn the role of these hormones and fit it to the context that they give you, because this graph could look like anything. They could present it in any kind of way. It could be a pie chart, who knows? But learn what they do, learn their roles, learn how they fit together, and apply it to a new context when you come into it. So let's look at contraception. So we're splitting contraception here loosely into two categories. We've got hormonal and non-hormonal. So we're going to look at the hormonal side first. And in these we have things like oral contraceptives. Now these are contraceptives that are taken by mouth, such as pills. And these can usually contain progesterone or estrogen or a combination of the both. And what the job is there is basically to almost mimic pregnancy, to tell your body, I'm not in the state ready to release eggs. I don't want to get pregnant. It's effectively what it's trying to do. Now, if, for example, you're taking in a high level of estrogen, remember estrogen's job, one of them is to prevent the release or to stop the production or release of FSH. So stopping FSH release will stop eggs from being matured, which is wonderful. Really simple job. By doing that, eggs won't be matured, they won't get released then, and so as a result you won't have ovulation. And it's simple. Contraception, that works. However, it's not super reliable because you have to remember to take it. If you do miss a day or two, it can throw everything out of control and throw off the chance of this working, and sometimes the pill doesn't work 100% of the time anyway, but usually it's pretty good. The next category that we're going to look at is injections or implants or skin patches, and these are just the same. So the hormones, rather than taking a pill, these can be good because an injection can last a few months. Implant can potentially last a couple of years, or a skin patch you just put on regularly. These you don't have to remember to take every single day, so they're a bit more reliable perhaps. But again, it is hormonal, so you're going to have different moods to just generally in a cycle, and it is going to do the same job. So usually things like estrogen, for example, stopping FSH production, that's what we're looking for it to try and do. But these can work for a number of months or years, as I say, and it's trying to inhibit the release, stop the release and the maturation of eggs. In the next category, we've got things called intrauterine devices, or IUDs. They're sometimes called for short. And an IUD sits inside. Uterine means uterus, so it sits inside the uterus, and it's this sort of shape. So the shape is there, so it sits inside the uterus, and it's got a coil of metal. It's sometimes called the coil. And this coil of metal will either release solely a hormone, or it's made of a kind of copper balance, which causes the uterus lining to not really allow implantation. So the egg cells will still get fertilized, but the implantation won't necessarily happen. Or the hormones will stop the maturation and release of eggs. But again, it's trying to prevent conception, so prevent the actual getting pregnant. The contraception as a term means stopping conception, stopping getting pregnant. And none of these have been developed really, apart from perhaps barrier methods. None of them have been developed to stop infection of sexually transmitted infections. These are here to stop pregnancy. So oral contraceptive and IUD, injection implant, skin patches, these will not stop you from getting horrible sexually transmitted infections. But the non-hormonal side, we have really good barrier methods like condoms and diaphragms. Condoms are probably the most common method of contraception across all of these examples, and they are a barrier which prevents STIs, prevents infection from things like HIV, gonorrhea, chlamydia, all this sort of horrible sexually transmitted infections I'm sure you've heard about outside or inside science. It prevents this infection, but it also prevents the transfer of sperm from the male to the female and prevents fertilization. However, they're not 100% effective. There is a chance that they won't work. There's a chance that they break. There's a chance that they won't fit properly or not being put on properly, or that they come off. And so there is a chance still of infection and a chance of conception. We also have surgical methods, which would mean basically sterilization of male or female. In the males, that means cutting or blocking of tubes that carry sperm from the testes through ejaculation, so it prevents the ejaculation of sperm. Again, not 100% effective. And for females, it can be things like applying clips or cutting or tying the fallopian tubes to prevent the egg from being able to release properly from the ovary. But again, not always 100% effective, but it can be long-lasting contraception. We then also have spermicidal agents, which can come in the form of creams that usually are found on condoms or diaphragms anyway, or should be added to diaphragms at least. But it basically kills or disables sperm, stopping them from travel to the egg to prevent the actual fertilization or the actual conception part. Again, it's not going to kill off any infections, viruses or bacteria or fungi or whatever. But the last method that we need to talk about is abstinence. And abstinence, these are all on the spec, by the way, every single method here. And abstaining from intercourse when an egg may be in the oviduct is going to prevent conception, because if you don't have sex when fertile, you won't get pregnant. It's quite as simple as that. Abstinence is the only one as well that will stop the transfer of sexually transmitted diseases in a guaranteed way. The common type of question you get asked here is an evaluation question, where they might give you some data in the form of a table or a graph, and you need to analyse it and discuss perhaps which one is the best method, and use the evidence that you have as well as your own knowledge to come to a kind of conclusion. And remember, whenever it says that word evaluate, you must use pros and cons, disadvantages, advantages, both sides, as part of forming an argument, if you like, and always make a concluding statement. A concluding statement will always get you that last mark. So if it's a 4-mark question or a 6-mark question, you'll only get 3 marks or 5 marks unless you write that last concluding statement. When we need to look at the last section here, we're looking at treating fertility. We need to remember that this is higher tier only. So if you're doing foundation, you don't need to worry about it. But in this, we're looking at how we can help fertility of people who are struggling to have children for whatever reason. Now, the two methods we need to know here, one is just how we can use hormones to help, and the second is a method using IVF to try and get a female pregnant. So first up, we can use hormones. Just quite simply, we can provide hormones to women to increase fertility, and these hormones come in the way of FSH and LH. FSH will cause the eggs to become mature, and LH will cause the release of eggs. Now, bear in mind that if we get this balance wrong, the FSH and LH could cause the release of multiple eggs and could lead to multiple births. So twins with fertility and hormone treatment are not uncommon, but it could also lead to triplets or even more. So it needs to be beared in mind. The method, though, of IVF is one that we need to be able to describe. It could be a 4-mark question, describe the process of in vitro fertilization. But in IVF, in vitro means in lab. So it's fertilization process is happening inside a lab rather than in the fallopian tubes in the lady herself. Now, to do this, what we need to do first is use FSH and LH to stimulate the maturation of several eggs. So these causes the maturation of the eggs in the ovaries and the release of them, or at least just the preparation of them. At this stage, we'll then take some of the eggs out of the ovaries, and by doing so, we then are able to fertilize them in a lab with sperm. Sperm may be from the father or from a donor or from wherever, but those are going to be fertilized in a lab. So in lab scenarios and lab setting, that's where the in vitro part comes from. These fertilized eggs will then develop slowly into embryos, again in the lab, but when they've grown into tiny balls of cells, 1 or 2 of these are then inserted into the mother's uterus, where they can then implant into the lining of the uterus and develop hopefully into full fetuses and eventually babies. But remember that we're only going to put in 1 or 2 embryos because these have a high chance of success, hopefully depending on the fertility of the mother. And if we put in 4 or 5, we could get 4 or 5 babies being born, and that puts a serious strain on the mother and on the other children that are being born too, which is a risk factor. But this process can be expensive. Typically in the NHS at the moment, I think you get one treatment for free if you have evidence of the fact that you've been struggling with fertility, but it can be successful. There is a chance that it won't be, and it is very physically demanding and obviously emotionally demanding if you're very much wanting to have children, and this is almost like the last chance that you have. And stress, both physical and emotional, is very difficult to balance and can actually decrease fertility significantly too.